September 6th, 2019. A property in Pleasant Valley, California. Quiet, rural, the kind of place where nothing ever happens. Detectives stand at the edge of a patch of disturbed earth on land neighboring a family home. A search warrant brought them here. What they're about to uncover will end a 7-week search and turn a missing persons case into a homicide investigation. When they reach her, Heather Gumina is still wearing a hospital smock, still wearing an arm sling, the same one she had on the night before she vanished, the night she walked out of an emergency room with a freshly broken collarbone and went home to the man who broke it. For 7 weeks, that man stood beside her family at search efforts, organized search parties of his own, told detectives she'd simply taken off. For 7 weeks, he knew exactly where she was the entire time. To understand how a woman ends up buried a few hundred feet from her own front door, in the same hospital clothes she was wearing less than a day before, you have to go back further. Back past the search parties, past the marriage, back to the first time the system had a chance to stop this and didn't take it. This is the story of Heather Gumina. To understand how this ends, you have to understand where it begins. A small rural pocket of El Dorado County, California, called Pleasant Valley. It is the kind of place where neighbors know each other by name, where properties stretch out with distance between them, where the nearest house might be a 5-minute drive rather than a 5-minute walk. It's the kind of place people move to specifically because it feels safe. Wide open land, low crime, a sense that everyone is watching out for everyone else. In a community like that, a missing person doesn't stay quiet for long. People notice, people organize, people show up with flashlights and trucks and spend their weekends combing fields, because that's simply what you do when someone in your community vanishes. It's a community built on trust, on the assumption that the people you wave to at the gas station are exactly who they appear to be. That trust, and how completely it was exploited, would later become one of the most devastating elements of this case. Heather Gumina was 33 years old. She was a mother of 3. The people who loved her, especially her mother, Joanna Russell, describe her in consistent terms. Loyal almost to a fault, endlessly empathetic, someone who looked for the good in people even when the evidence in front of her suggested she shouldn't. She was, by every account pieced together after her death, the kind of person who showed up for others without being asked. The kind of person whose friends describe her as the one who checked in, who remembered birthdays, who gave second chances long after most people would have stopped. It would be easy, looking at this case from the outside, to ask why a woman like that stayed in a relationship that was clearly dangerous. But anyone who has studied domestic violence will tell you that staying is rarely about naivety. Often, it's a calculation, made and remade every single day. A mother weighing her own safety against the safety of her children. A woman weighing the unpredictability of what leaving might trigger against the false sense of control that comes from staying close enough to manage the danger herself. A person weighing all of that against a justice system that, as you're about to see, did not exactly inspire confidence that it would protect her if she tried to walk away. Her empathy, the very thing the people who loved her admired most, would ultimately be the trait used against her. It is one of the cruelest patterns in domestic violence cases. The better, kinder, more forgiving a victim is, the more exploitable that trait becomes in the hands of someone who has learned exactly how to manipulate it. The man at the center of this story is Anthony John Gumina. At the time of the events that made this case a headline, he was 44 years old. If you'd asked his friends about him before any of this came to light, you would have heard a familiar kind of description. Charming, easygoing, the guy you'd grab a beer with, someone who showed up to barbecues and seemed, by all outward appearances, completely unremarkable in the worst possible neighbor sense. Several of them, when news broke of what he'd done, refused to believe it. Some publicly defended him in the early days of the investigation, insisting there had to be another explanation. That disbelief is not unusual in these cases, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because it reveals something important about how abuse actually operates. It rarely announces itself publicly. Abusers like Anthony tend to live double lives. One version of themselves performed for the world, polished and likable, and an entirely different version reserved for behind closed doors, where there are no witnesses and no consequences. Behind that closed door, those who knew Heather best describe Anthony as controlling, volatile, and consumed by a fragile, exaggerated sense of his own pride. He needed to be seen as in charge, as respected, as untouchable, and anything that threatened that image, even something as small as a disagreement, could trigger disproportionate rage. That detail, pride, is not incidental. It will resurface later, in his own words, in a courtroom, in a moment that tells you almost everything you need to know about who he really was. Now, quick gut check before we go further into this, because it only gets heavier from here. If you've ever found yourself frustrated by people asking, "Why didn't she just leave?" in cases like this, drop a comment below. I want to know if you've seen that question asked in your own life, because I think by the end of this video, you'll see exactly why it misses the point. The first major warning sign the public record shows us comes from January 31st, 2019. During a domestic incident that escalated severely, Heather made a decision that mothers in dangerous homes often have to make in seconds. She barricaded herself and her 4-year-old child inside a bathroom, putting a locked door between them and Anthony. It's worth picturing that moment honestly. A bathroom door is not a fortress. It's a thin piece of wood with a flimsy lock, the kind of barrier that buys seconds, not safety. Heather knew that. She barricaded herself there anyway, because in that moment, it was the only option she had. Anthony forced his way in, regardless. In the middle of that chaos, Heather managed to get word to authorities. Anthony was arrested. The charges were serious: felony domestic violence and child endangerment. On paper, this should have been the moment the story ended differently. The system had him. There was an arrest, a case, a paper trail of exactly how dangerous he was, documented by police, witnessed by his own 4-year-old child. And then came the failure that, when you look back at this case with the full picture, is almost impossible to read without feeling a flash of anger. Despite the severity of the charges, a judge released Anthony from custody, directly overriding the explicit objections of the district attorney's office. The prosecutors who reviewed this case in real time, who saw the evidence, who understood exactly what kind of danger Anthony posed, argued against his release. They made the case, formally, that this was not a man who should be back on the street. They were overruled. He walked free. He went home. And the woman he had terrorized just days earlier was still living under the same roof he was about to return to, with nowhere else to take her children and no guarantee that leaving would make her any safer than staying. This is one of the most important threads running through Heather's story, and it's worth pausing on directly. The justice system had a documented opportunity to keep a violent offender away from his victim, and it did not take it. Whatever happens later in this story, that decision sits underneath all of it. It's not a footnote. It's the hinge the entire tragedy turns on. What followed his release is something domestic violence researchers have a name for: the honeymoon phase. It's a recognizable, almost scripted pattern, documented across thousands of cases that look nothing alike on the surface, but follow the exact same internal logic. After an explosive incident, the abuser becomes the picture of remorse, flowers, tears, promises that this was the last time, that he's going to get help, that he sees now what he never let himself see before. He apologizes with what feels, in the moment, like total sincerity. And that's part of what makes it so effective. He isn't lying badly. He's lying in a way that is calibrated, consciously or not, to exploit the exact empathy of the person he hurt, because he knows that empathy is real, and he knows precisely how to use it. Heather, by every account, was deeply empathetic. Anthony used that. Weeks after his arrest for domestic violence and child endangerment, the two of them got married. Read that again, because it deserves a moment of weight. Weeks after being arrested for barricading a 4-year-old and his mother in a bathroom, Heather Gumina married Heather. If you're watching this and thinking that timeline doesn't make sense, you're right. It doesn't make sense from the outside. It makes a tragic kind of sense from the inside of a manipulation cycle that very few people escape without help. And an even smaller number escape once that cycle is reinforced by something as legally and emotionally binding as a marriage. By the summer of 2019, the criminal case from January was still hanging over Anthony. A trial was approaching for the felony charges, and Heather, the woman he had married, was the primary witness against him. Think about what that means for a moment. The person whose testimony could send him to prison was sleeping in the same bed as him every night, sharing meals with him, raising children under the same roof. There was no distance between the witness and the man she would be testifying against. There was no safety in proximity. There was only proximity. His fear of that trial, of the very real possibility of incarceration, appears to have triggered a fresh wave of aggression as the court date drew closer. On July 15th, 2019, Anthony subjected Heather to a brutal physical assault that left her with severe injuries, including a broken collarbone. She sought treatment at a local hospital, and in a moment that, in hindsight, reads like a desperate flare sent up into the dark, she didn't call the police. She was reportedly too afraid of what Anthony might do if she did, afraid that calling the police a second time would provoke something even worse than what had already happened. Instead, she sent a text message to her mother. 4 words. "He tried to kill me." Sit with that phrase for a second, because it's not vague. It's not an exaggeration born out of an argument. It is a direct, specific statement from a woman who, at that exact moment, believed her life was in danger from her own husband. And despite how serious her injuries clearly were, despite the obvious signs of trauma, she was discharged from the hospital that same night. No extended hold. No intervention beyond treating the physical wound in front of them. No one asking the question that, in hindsight, feels impossible to overlook. Where is she going to go tonight? And is it safe? She left the hospital still in her smock, her arm in a sling, her hospital ID bracelet still around her wrist. And she went home, back to him. This is the smock, the sling, the bracelet you saw at the very start of this video. The same ones she was still wearing when she was found. If you're finding this as infuriating as I did researching it, I want you to do two things for me. First, hit that like button. It genuinely helps push cases like Heather's in front of more people, and more awareness is exactly what prevents the next one. Second, I want you to think about that text message for a second. He tried to kill me. If someone in your life sent you those exact words, would you know what to do in the next 10 minutes? Drop your answer in the comments. I think the discussion there might matter more than anything I say in this video. The morning of July 16th, 2019, was the last morning of Heather Gumina's life. Heather's mother was at the house briefly that morning and witnessed a heated argument between Heather and Anthony. But this wasn't an argument rooted in remorse over what he had done to her the day before. By the accounts pieced together afterward, Anthony wasn't focused on the fact that he had broken his wife's collarbone. He was focused on what that broken collarbone would look like to a district attorney already building a felony case against him. In his mind, Heather's visible injuries weren't evidence of his own violence. They were a liability, a threat to his freedom. Somewhere in the warped internal logic that governed Anthony Gumina, his wife had stopped being a person and become a problem to be solved. After Heather's mother left the property, Anthony was alone with Heather. What happened next is the act this entire case revolves around. The moment Anthony decided that the woman who had testified against him once, who could put him behind bars permanently, needed to be silenced for good. He took her life that day. What came next reveals exactly the kind of man Anthony Gumina was, because the violence itself was only the beginning of what he was capable of. He picked up the phone and called Heather's mother, the same woman who had stood in that house hours earlier, and told her, with what investigators would later characterize as a convincing display of panic, that Heather had simply taken off after their argument. Not hurt, not missing under suspicious circumstances, just gone, on her own, the way people sometimes go when they need space. For the next 7 weeks, Anthony performed the role of a distraught, abandoned husband. He let Heather's family organize search parties. He stood among neighbors as they planned routes through Pleasant Valley, handed out flyers, posted in community groups, all while knowing with total certainty where Heather's remains actually were. He let the community comb through fields and back roads looking for a woman he already knew was never going to be found that way. He repeatedly lied to detectives, sending the investigation down false paths, actively obstructing the search for the truth while presenting himself publicly as a man desperate for his wife's safe return. He gave interviews. He accepted condolences. He let people hug him and tell him to stay strong. For 7 weeks, he got to live inside the lie he constructed, while Heather's mother, the woman who received that "he tried to kill me" text only days before, was left to hope, to wonder, to imagine every possible version of where her daughter might be, except the one that was true. It's worth pausing here to ask yourself something honestly. Have you ever encountered someone in your own life who you later realized was performing a version of themselves that had nothing to do with who they actually were? Not on this scale, obviously, but that gap between public persona and private truth? Let me know in the comments, because I think it's one of the most unsettling parts of cases like this. The realization that the mask can be worn convincingly enough to fool an entire community for weeks. The case shifted dramatically on September 6th, 2019. Detectives located Heather's abandoned vehicle, and with that discovery, the missing persons case was reclassified as a homicide investigation. The community that had spent 7 weeks hoping for a reunion now had to absorb a far darker possibility, one that many of them, including people who had stood beside Anthony at vigils and search efforts, had refused to even consider. Acting on new leads, authorities executed a search warrant on a property neighboring the Gumina's own home, right there in Pleasant Valley. The same close-knit community that had spent 7 weeks searching for her. The proximity is almost unbearable to think about. While search parties fanned out across the wider area, the answer was sitting just down the road the entire time. What they found ended the search and confirmed the worst possible outcome. This is the moment from the start of this video. Heather's remains, concealed underground, still wearing the smock and sling from her hospital visit the night before she disappeared. That detail does more than confirm a timeline. It tells you, with brutal clarity, that the last day of Heather Gumina's life began in a hospital bed, being treated for injuries her husband inflicted on her, and ended less than 24 hours later, with her body buried just down the road from the home they shared. There was no transition, no time for her to recover, to plan, to escape. Just hours. Anthony Gumina was arrested that same day. And here's the detail that doesn't get nearly enough attention in coverage of this case. He wasn't the only one arrested. A second individual, Justin Kremer, was later taken into custody as an accessory to the crime. It's a detail that adds another disturbing layer to this story. The idea that concealing a murder of this nature required help. That somewhere in Anthony's circle, someone was willing to assist in hiding what he had done, whether out of loyalty, fear, or some combination of both. It's a reminder that these crimes don't always happen in total isolation. Sometimes the cover-up has more than one set of hands on it. Faced with overwhelming physical evidence and a timeline that left no real room for denial, Anthony Gumina chose not to take his chances at trial. On June 23, 2021, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and felony domestic violence. Nearly 2 years after Heather's death, 2 years in which her family had to live with the knowledge of what happened to her while waiting for the legal process to catch up to it. If you were hoping for a moment of genuine remorse in that courtroom, the record offers none. During his confession, Anthony attempted to explain, not apologize for, explain, his actions by claiming that Heather had insulted his pride and honor. Remember that detail from earlier in this video, the one about his fragile, exaggerated sense of pride? This is where it resurfaces, in his own words, as the closest thing he offered to a motive. Not fear, not desperation, wounded pride. A grown man standing in a courtroom, attempting to frame the murder of his wife as a matter of personal honor, as though her death were a debt that needed settling rather than the violent end of a human life. He was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. And in his final act of cruelty in that courtroom, He refused to even look at Heather's family as they delivered their victim impact statements, denying them until the very last moment, even the basic acknowledgement of what he had taken from them. There's a version of this story that ends right there, with a sentence and a number of years. But I don't think that's where the real weight of Heather's case lives. I think it lives in the questions this case forces us to confront. Questions that don't go away just because the courtroom doors closed. Heather wasn't just a victim of domestic violence. She was the primary witness in a criminal case against her abuser. And that distinction matters enormously. Research and case history both show the same pattern again and again. The most dangerous moment for a victim is often not during the relationship itself, but at the exact point where she becomes a threat to her abuser's freedom or control. Heather's testimony could have put Anthony away for years. That made her not just a wife he wanted to control, but a witness he believed he needed to eliminate. Then there's the systemic failure that sits at the foundation of this entire tragedy. The moment in January 2019, when a judge overrode the district attorney's explicit warning and released a man charged with felony, domestic violence, and child endangerment back into the world, back to the woman he would eventually kill. When the people whose job it is to evaluate danger are ignored, the cost of that decision doesn't disappear. It gets paid by someone else, later, often in the worst way imaginable. Heather's case is, in many ways, a case study in exactly how that cost gets paid. And then there's the question we opened this video with. Why didn't she just leave? By now, I hope that question feels different than it did at the start. Heather didn't stay because she was foolish or weak. She stayed inside a cycle that researchers have documented for decades. Fear, the safety of her children, and the psychological fog of a honeymoon phase engineered specifically to pull her back in. The mask Anthony wore in public, the one that fooled friends who genuinely could not believe he was capable of this. That mask is part of why these patterns are so hard to see from the outside and so hard to escape from the inside. And finally, there's the text message. He tried to kill me. 4 words sent to a parent describing exactly what had just happened. If there's one thing this case should leave you with, it's this. When someone in your life sends a message like that, the moment for hesitation is already over. It often requires immediate, decisive action, even action the person themselves might resist in the moment. Because by the time someone is terrified enough to send those words, they may already be too afraid to make the next move on their own. Heather Gumina deserved protection that the system failed to give her. Not once, but repeatedly, from a courtroom in January to a hospital discharge in July. Her story isn't just a true crime case to be consumed and moved past. It's a documented failure with real lessons. And the only way those lessons matter is if they actually change how the people watching this respond the next time they see the warning signs in their own lives. If this case affected you the way it affected me, do 3 things before you go. Subscribe so you don't miss the next case we dig into. There are far too many stories like Heather's that don't get the attention they deserve. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And down in the comments, I want to hear from you honestly. What part of Heather's story is going to stay with you the longest? I read every single comment. And on a case like this one, I think the conversation matters as much as the story itself. Rest in peace, Heather. your story doesn't end with his sentence. It continues every time someone watches this and recognizes the signs in time to do something different.